Officials initially believed she may have passed away as early as February 11th, but we now know she was alive on the 12th.
40 feet beneath the floor of Gene Hackman's private library sits a slab of carbon steel welded shut from the outside, with no handle, no hinges, and no mechanism on either face. When federal forensics teams reached it, the DNA recovered from the chamber surrounding it triggered a national security classification within hours. The case was pulled from standard channels before the press ever heard the word tunnel. And what the testing actually confirmed isn't a discovery about an old building. It's a verdict on the man who spent the final years of his life keeping that door sealed.
Authorities telling ABC News exclusively that Hackman's wife called a concierge medical service called Cloudberry.
The story everyone accepted. When Hackman died at his Santa Fe estate in New Mexico, the official explanation seemed to write itself. He was 95 years old. His wife Betsy Arakawa had already passed, an elderly man, isolated in grief, withdrawing from the world until his body finally gave out. Betsy's cause of death was attributed to a severe viral infection. Hackman's was listed as heart failure with Alzheimer's as a contributing factor. Even the appearance of federal agents at the estate barely registered. Police body camera footage showed deputies finding 65-year-old Arakawa dead in a bathroom.
I respect Mr. Hackman's and Ms. Arakawa's regard for privacy. I think everybody here understands that they were very private individuals and a very private family.
Hackman was found near the kitchen, close to the front door. The federal response was chalked up to standard protocol when high-profile estates change hands unexpectedly. The heavy steel gates, the motion sensors ringing the property, the thermal cameras mounted along the perimeter walls. Those were the expected eccentricities of a Hollywood legend who had spent decades fending off paparazzi. The non-disclosure agreements legally imposed on every employee were reasonable, private, understandable. The estate sat enclosed behind solid stone walls, hidden entirely from the region's main road network. Nobody who drove past it ever thought twice. When the timeline stopped making sense, when the first federal forensics team walked through the front door, they weren't walking into the aftermath of a quiet death. They were walking into a scene that had been deliberately managed. The moment they pulled the behavioral timeline from the security server data, every clean assumption began to break. Medical investigators determined the couple died approximately a week apart. Arakawa died first from hantavirus. Hackman died days later, 7 full days. During that window, the estate's entire telecommunications system recorded 0 outgoing calls. No emergency services, no family, no medical contact of any kind. For 7 days, a 95-year-old man with documented heart disease sat alone in a sealed compound with his wife's body and never once reached for the phone.
New details about the deaths of Oscar-winning actor Gene Hackman and his wife.
The central security server data told the rest of the story. The bedroom furniture had been dragged from its original position. Personal safes had been forced open. And on the very day Betsy died, Hackman manually entered the code to disable all internal surveillance cameras while keeping the outer perimeter alarms locked at maximum sensitivity. That configuration isn't panic. That's architecture. The deliberate blinding of one system and the calculated preservation of another, made by someone who understood exactly what they needed to conceal. The behavioral analysts were unambiguous. This was not emotional disorientation. This was the unmistakable signature of a deliberate containment process designed to blind the internal environment while maintaining the outer barrier at full strength. What the ground scans revealed. The physical inconsistencies forced agents to go deeper, literally. LiDAR scanning equipment and thermal imaging arrays were deployed across the entire property. LiDAR works by bouncing high-speed laser pulses off surfaces and measuring return time with extraordinary precision, allowing investigators to construct three-dimensional maps of hidden voids beneath any structure. It's the same technology used to locate ancient cities buried beneath jungle canopies. Here, it was pointed downward through the floors of a dead man's home. During the very first scan pass, the system flagged a deep temperature anomaly extending from behind the wall of Hackman's private library, dropping down through dozens of meters of solid New Mexico bedrock. Agents cross-referenced the result against county civil planning records. The underground structure the LiDAR had just mapped did not appear in any civil planning record on file. It had never been registered. It had never been disclosed. It didn't officially exist. The entrance was concealed behind a bookshelf. There was no biometric scanner, no electronic switch, no wireless signal of any kind. What secured that passage was a complex mechanical locking system embedded directly into wood and steel, a precise sequence of physical actions that had to be performed entirely by hand, requiring significant force to disengage solid steel bolts embedded in the frame, a system that generates no radio frequency signature, a system that continues to function during a complete power failure. Whoever engineered this entrance built it for permanence, for secrecy, and for resilience under conditions most people would never think to plan for. A tunnel, older than the house above it.
A cloud of suspicion surrounds the deaths of Oscar-winning actor Gene Hackman and his wife, whose bodies were found in their Santa Fe home.
Agents stepped through the entrance and descended. The tunnel's upper section, closest to ground level, was reinforced with poured concrete and steel beams. Dr. Marcus Elford, a structural engineer attached to the Federal Forensic Response Team, examined the rivet spacing and went quiet for several seconds before speaking. The spacing and pour method matched military-grade security construction standards from the 1950s. He told the lead investigator that in 30 years of structural assessment, he had only seen that specific rivet configuration in 2 other places. Both were classified federal installations. But at a depth of 40 feet, everything changed. The industrial concrete stopped. The steel beams disappeared. What replaced them were rough stone walls carved with thousands of primitive tool marks. The air quality in the lower section revealed something deeply unsettling. Unnatural thermal gradients, sudden shifts in humidity, a dense concentration of oxidized metallic particles suspended in the atmosphere. The kind of chemical signature left by prolonged exposure to materials that had no business being inside a sealed natural cave. The hand-carved stone core of this tunnel was not a modern construction. It was part of an ancient artificial geological formation, carved by human hands long before the military-era upper section was ever built above it. Whatever this tunnel's original purpose had been, it predated the estate. It may have predated anyone currently alive who knew about it. If what's underneath that estate is older than the estate itself, the next part is where this story stops being a mystery and starts becoming a verdict. Subscribe and hit the bell, because what the DNA actually confirmed is the part the federal response was designed to bury. What the DNA testing actually found. The dust samples taken from the tunnel's mechanical locking mechanism told a story that shifted the entire investigation. Special forensic technician Raymond Voss, attached to the federal evidence team out of the Albuquerque field office, was the first analyst to examine the gears under magnification. He had been told to look for anything inconsistent with long-term disuse. What he saw through the eyepiece stopped him cold. Where decades of dormancy should have produced a uniform layer of oxidation across every contact surface, the gear teeth showed bright streaks of bare metal. Tiny crescent-shaped abrasions where steel had been freshly polished by the friction of recent operation. The corrosion pattern was wrong in both directions, scrubbed clean along the active surfaces, untouched everywhere else. He set down his instruments and called his supervisor before writing a single word in his report. The metallic abrasion marks were not months old, not years old, days old, aligning with forensic precision to the 7-day window between Betsy Arakawa's death and Gene Hackman's. A 95-year-old man in the final stages of cardiac decline had not spent his last days confined to a bed. He had descended into that tunnel. He had operated those heavy mechanical locks. He had gone down into the cold subterranean dark at some point during those final 7 days and returned before collapsing for the last time. But it was the DNA analysis pulled from organic material collected deeper inside the tunnel that changed the nature of the investigation entirely. The genetic material recovered from the deepest sections of the chamber indicated exposure to biological conditions that should not exist in an isolated subterranean space beneath a private estate in Santa Fe. The specific classification of what was identified has not been released publicly. The fact that it was classified at all is the part that shifts this story from forensics, curiosity into personal indictment. What has been confirmed through sources close to the initial forensic team is this. The DNA findings triggered an immediate escalation of the federal response. The case was pulled out of standard investigative channels and routed through classification protocols typically reserved for matters of active national security infrastructure. Not historical curiosity, active, ongoing concern. The organic material had no innocent explanation. Its presence confirmed that the tunnel had not been dormant. Something biological, something that produced recoverable DNA trace evidence, had been active in that space. The people with the authority to classify that finding decided within hours that the public did not need to know what it was. Whatever Hackman had been monitoring carried state-level significance that went far beyond the private choices of a retired actor in the New Mexico desert. Atmospheric samples from the deepest section registered chemical compounds associated with organic metabolic processes, not ancient residue, not geological off-gassing, active compounds produced by living biological systems. The forensic record now confirmed that Hackman had not simply tolerated the existence of the tunnel. He had been actively maintaining whatever was producing those signatures right up until the day his heart finally stopped. The chamber at the bottom. When the full investigation team reached the base of the tunnel, they entered a chamber that dismantled every framework they had brought with them. The natural stone floor had been deliberately leveled. Its surface was engraved with a complex system of astronomical coordinates carved directly into the rock, a precise mapping of planetary orbits traced with mathematical instruments, depicting alignments that appeared to correspond to specific celestial dates. The geometry was too disciplined for ornamentation. It looked like a reference grid, a system designed to track something against a fixed astronomical schedule. Wooden crates were scattered across the floor, containing metallurgical components of unknown origin. Many were cast as single solid pieces with no welding seams, no rivets, no visible joints of any kind. The team examined 3 of them under field magnification and found no surface evidence that they had ever been assembled from smaller parts. The forming method had no precedent in documented early 20th century industrial metalwork. Whoever produced these objects had access to fabrication techniques that did not match any known historical workshop in the region. But none of that was what stopped the room. Embedded along the rough stone wall, secured with corrosion-resistant metal brackets, was a closed-circuit communication system. A thick coaxial cable insulated with industrial rubber penetrated through the wall above and cut through dozens of meters of solid bedrock before terminating in the heart of the chamber. Electrical systems analyst Dr. Claire Souza, on secondment from a federal infrastructure assessment unit, was brought in to evaluate it. She confirmed on the record that this was not a relic from an old renovation. When she traced the power source, she found a localized alkaline battery array operating completely independently of the estate's electrical grid above, sized to run without interruption even during a total surface power failure. She told colleagues it was one of the most deliberate pieces of electrical infrastructure she had assessed outside of a classified facility. The system was active. When Souza dismantled the connectors, she found no microphone, no speaker, no mechanism for voice communication of any kind. The cable terminated in a large mechanical signal transducer, a device whose sole function was to be pressed against solid surfaces and capture extremely low-frequency vibrations, minute pressure fluctuations, subtle movements traveling through the dense stone walls, converted into electrical signals and transmitted upward through the buried cable directly to a concealed monitoring speaker inside Hackman's private living quarters above. For an unknown number of years, Hackman had not simply been living in that estate. He had been stationed there, listening, not to voices, not to broadcasts, not to the outside world, but to the vibrations of whatever was pressing against the far side of a sealed wall 40 feet below his bedroom floor. The door that was never meant to open. At the terminal end of that analog cable, bonded with industrial epoxy to the deepest structure at the farthest wall of the chamber, where the cavern narrowed into an unnatural constriction, was a massive iron door. It was not made from modern ballistic materials. It was carbon steel, weathered by considerable age, completely flat, no external handle, no mechanical lock, no electronic keypad, no visible hinges on either face. Every seam along its perimeter, every point where the door met the natural stone frame surrounding it, had been sealed with continuous weld lines. unbroken, permanent, applied entirely from the exterior. This is the detail that broke the investigative framework completely. A bunker door is built to protect those inside from intrusion. The handle, the bolt, the hinges, the locking mechanism, all of it exists, so the people inside maintain control. They can open it, they can exit. But a door welded permanently shut from the exterior with no mechanism on either face follows a completely different logic. It is not a door built to protect. It is a door built to contain. When this single detail reached the federal investigators, it inverted the entire narrative of the estate above. The towering stone walls, the strict confidentiality agreements, the total isolation from the surrounding road and utility infrastructure, Hackman's deliberate disabling of his own internal surveillance cameras. Assembled together in the light of that welded steel door, not one of these measures reads like the privacy precautions of a famous man tired of cameras. He was not protecting himself from the world. He was protecting the world from whatever existed on the other side of that sealed barrier. For years, possibly for the last 2 full decades of his life, Hackman had been the sole civilian warden of a geological containment structure, using the estate's perimeter defenses to prevent accidental access to the tunnel entrance, relying on the analog cable to continuously track the pressure, the rhythm, and the vibrations of whatever the iron door was holding back. The next decision proved exactly what Hackman had been carrying alone. They had plasma cutting equipment on site, industrial-grade tools capable of breaching any steel structure within minutes. Not a single agent present was authorized to activate it. National security specialists stood before that rusted door, analyzed the weld lines, documented the astronomical star map carved into the floor, and made one decision. Everything stays sealed. They refused to open what one man had spent his entire life keeping closed. The lockdown that followed. The moment technical reports detailing the welded door, the listening cable, and the classified DNA findings reached Central Command, evidence collection was halted entirely. A total information lockdown was imposed. Local reporters attempting to approach the perimeter were turned back by military police. Ownership of the surrounding forest land was placed under special government control. Every Freedom of Information Act request seeking the structural plans was denied under the highest available classification protocols. Then, independent investigators discovered the data erasure. Resident complaints filed between 2019 and the present, reports submitted by people living several miles from the estate, had been systematically removed from every state database accessible to civilian researchers. Those complaints had described a recurring low-frequency mechanical vibration emanating from underground at approximately 2 in the morning. Civilian seismic sensors had recorded these disturbances. Local authorities had dismissed them in writing as interference from public plumbing or underground heating infrastructure. Those records no longer existed in any state system. The unmarked military transport convoys that arrived at the property under cover of night carried signal shielding technology. Their movement bore no resemblance to a standard federal forensics response. It was the coordinated rotation of a risk management apparatus that had clearly been in place for a very long time. One that already knew what was down there and had simply been waiting for the right moment to step back in. A powerful, unseen authority had long been aware of the tunnel, the chamber, the containment door, and the listening system. They moved to reclaim it as an existing asset, one they had apparently allowed a single civilian to maintain, finance, and guard at his own expense for decades, while they remained invisible in the background. Only when the last watchman finally collapsed did they emerge from the shadows to take back what they had always been watching over. If Hackman had been acting alone, why did the federal government have a classified response protocol already in place? Why were plasma cutting teams pre-authorized to be on site but prohibited from using their equipment? The speed of that response doesn't describe a government discovering something unexpected. It describes a government managing a known situation that had just become public. What the final 7 days were really for. When the microforensic evidence, the signal transmission data, the classified DNA findings, and the sealed welded door are examined together, Hackman's silence during the 7 days following Betsy's death stops being explainable as grief or psychological collapse. It was a security protocol executed to its absolute limit by a man who understood precisely what failure would cost. The moment Betsy took her last breath, Hackman's failing heart was confronted with an unforgiving calculation. A single emergency call would have triggered an unstoppable chain reaction. local police, emergency responders, forensic teams, media, people with no knowledge of the containment protocols, no awareness of the tunnel, no understanding of what was sealed 40 feet below the library floor. They would inevitably reach the bookshelf. Ordinary human curiosity, just the instinct of investigators doing their jobs, could have disrupted the mechanical locking sequence, interrupted the signal line, or drawn direct attention to the iron door and whatever lay behind it. He made a choice. He disabled the internal surveillance cameras. He descended the stone steps one last time. He operated the heavy mechanical locks, verifying the containment remained intact. He returned to the surface, and inside the sealed silent house, with the monitoring speaker in his private quarters still transmitting the low-frequency rhythm from the bedrock below, he sat down and listened until his own heartbeat finally stopped. The verdict the DNA testing actually delivered was not about a tunnel. It was about a man who chose, for an unknown number of years, to let his wife and an entire community live above something he knew the full nature of and never disclosed. A man who, in the final week of his life, prioritized the integrity of a welded iron door over a phone call that could have saved him. The official record will list heart failure as the cause of death. The forensic record tells a different story. He died exactly the way he had lived, listening to the wall, guarding what was behind it. Beneath the bedrock of the Santa Fe desert, the corroded iron door remains, its welds unbroken. The low-frequency vibration continues its mechanical rhythm against the far side of the steel, exactly as it did when Hackman was alive to hear it. So what was Gene Hackman really listening to for the last 20 years of his life? And why did the federal government already have a protocol in place for the day he finally stopped listening? Drop your theory in the comments. Subscribe for more investigations that go where the official record stops.